Episode 5, Discretionary Trusts versus Fixed Interest Trusts. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Vellen, and welcome to Trusts Unpacked, where we strip away myth and marketing and explain in plain and simple terms how trusts actually work in real families. I spent more than 28 years working as a banker and fiduciary. Over that time, I've advised more than 100 families and individuals, from Polynesia to Japan, Canada to India, South Africa to the UK, as well as several hundred professional intermediaries and their companies, all looking to deepen their practical understanding of trusts and their use across multiple jurisdictions. Alongside this advisory work, I'm a published author. I've completed a trilogy that reflects both the technical and human dimensions of both the fiduciary and private banking fields. Before we begin, a brief but important note. This podcast is provided for general information and discussion only. It does not constitute legal, tax, fiduciary, or professional advice, and it should not be relied upon as such, because as ever, you should always seek advice from appropriately qualified professionals in your relevant jurisdiction before making decisions or taking action. In the last session, we looked at how various different trust structures shape behavior. Today, we're going to narrow that to a single decision point by looking at the two core types of trust, discretionary trusts and fixed interest trusts, in more detail. Don't worry, this session is not about legal definitions. It is far more about how those two types of trusts behave in practice. The choice between them shapes control, flexibility, risk, and family dynamics for years, sometimes for decades. Understanding those differences, therefore, matters. Part 1. Why this distinction is so important. Many trust problems arise because the wrong structure was chosen at the outset, not because drafting was poor, but because the structure just didn't fit the family's reality. Discretionary trusts and fixed interest trusts solve totally different problems. Trying to make one behave like the other usually ends really badly. So let's start with behavior, not labels. Most families don't struggle to understand the difference between a discretionary and a fixed interest trust. They just struggle to choose. So the difficulty is not technical, it's not legal, it's psychological. A discretionary trust feels non-committal, it postpones finality. It allows families to believe that they're keeping options open. A fixed interest trust, by contrast, feels declarative. It locks in assumptions. It exposes preferences. It makes future disagreement more likely, at least in the short term. Faced with that contrast, many families default to avoidance. They tell themselves that flexibility now is prudent and certainty can be added later. That the structure can evolve as circumstances clarify. That no real harm is done by waiting. But that is rarely true. The belief that one can defer the choice without consequence is one of the most persistent myths in trust planning. Structures don't just sit neutrally whilst families decide. They begin shaping behavior immediately. Expectations are forming. Patterns are settling. Authority is distributing itself in ways that are actually really difficult to reverse. By the time a family feels ready to choose, the structure has often already chosen for them. Advisors sometimes reinforce this avoidance, albeit unintentionally. Language such as, well, we can always revisit this, or let's not over-engineer at this stage, sound reassuring. It reduces friction. It keeps conversations moving. But it also masks the reality that some decisions become harder, not easier, with time. Choosing discretion over certainty is not just a placeholder. It's a commitment to a particular way of managing disagreement, dependency, and disappointment. Choosing certainty over discretion is not rigidity. It's a commitment to living with constraint rather than negotiation. And sadly, there is no neutral ground between the two. Families often sense this, which is why the choice feels uncomfortable. It forces an admission about trust, maturity, and control. It requires families to confront how much ambiguity they can genuinely tolerate and how much clarity they are prepared to live with. Avoidance offers temporary relief. It preserves surface harmony. It delays difficult conversations. But it also guarantees that those conversations will arrive later under less favorable conditions. So in practice, delay is rarely neutral. From the moment a trust is settled, behavior begins to form around it. Trustees learn how much latitude they have. Beneficiaries learn what kinds of requests are entertained. Informal expectations settle long before anything is written down. What begins as provisional becomes habitual. Early distributions, even if they're modest, establish a reference point. Silence is interpreted as consent. Patterns harden quietly, not because anyone intended them to, but because human beings seek stability in uncertainty. By the time families feel ready to revisit the structure, the trust already carries a history. Decisions that once would have felt natural now feel disruptive. Changes that might have been sensible early on are experienced as withdrawals or losses. This is where timing matters. Choosing discretion at the outset with the intention of adding certainty later often produces the opposite effect. Discretion exercised over time creates expectations that make later restriction feel punitive. Trustees who attempt to tighten boundaries after years of flexibility are accused of inconsistency at the very least, because beneficiaries feel misled even when nothing was actually promised. And the same is true in reverse. Families who begin with informal certainty and intend to introduce discretion later often discover that entitlement, once established, is extraordinarily difficult to unpick. What felt manageable in the short term becomes politically and emotionally entrenched. In both cases, the structure has already shaped behavior before the choice was consciously made. This is why advisors sometimes speak about locking in early. Not because early decisions are necessarily better, but because early decisions are honest about trade-offs. Choosing early forces families to confront discomfort whilst relationships are still flexible. It allows expectations to form around clarity rather than ambiguity. It makes disappointment part of the design rather than a later surprise. Delay avoids that discomfort temporarily, but at the cost of amplifying it later. By the time families feel ready to choose, they are often no longer free to do so without consequence. This is why the distinction between discretionary and fixed interest trusts is not simply a matter of preference, it's also a matter of timing. The earlier the choice is made, the more humane it tends to be. Part 2. Discretionary trusts, how they behave. In a discretionary trust, no beneficiary has a guaranteed entitlement. Trustees decide if, when, and how benefits are provided. This gives trustees significant flexibility. They can respond to changes in need, changes in behavior, changes in family circumstance. This flexibility is the main strength of discretionary trusts. It allows trustees to differentiate between beneficiaries without breaching the structure. But flexibility comes with consequences. Beneficiaries have to learn to live with uncertainty. Expectations must be managed carefully, and trustees carry a far heavier responsibility. In the first generation, the context is usually clear. The settlor's intentions are fresh. The trustees understand absolutely the family dynamics. Beneficiaries are still forming expectations. Discretion feels kind of anchored, even when outcomes vary. But this early success can be misleading. What works well in the first decade, let's say, is often assumed to be structurally sound. In reality, it may simply be operating in favorable conditions. And as time passes, several shifts occur. Trustees may change. Institutional memory may thin. Decisions that were once explained in person may be inherited only as records. New trustees read precedent without having lived through the reasoning that produced it. At the same time, beneficiaries change. Children become adults. Circumstances diverge. Comparisons multiply. What once felt contingent begins to feel inconsistent. And this is where discretionary trusts are tested. In the second generation, discretion must function without the emotional ballast of the settlor's presence. Authority rests entirely with trustees who did not design the structure and may not share the original confidence behind it. Now, where governance is strong, this transition can be managed. Trustees articulate principles explicitly. They resist being bound by past distributions where circumstances have changed. They're willing to reassert discretion even when it causes friction. But where governance is weak, discretion decays. Past patterns harden into expectation. Trustees fear destabilizing relationships by changing approach. Decisions become backward-looking. Discretion is exercised, but only within an increasingly narrowing corridor. This is how discretionary trusts become conservative, even when flexibility was the original objective. There is also a cumulative emotional cost. Discretion requires beneficiaries to live with uncertainty not once, but repeatedly. Over time, even resilient individuals can tire of that uncertainty. Requests become more guarded. Engagement becomes more transactional. The trust is experienced less as a framework for stewardship and more as an obstacle that needs navigation. Trustees feel this too. What was once meaningful judgment can begin to feel like exposure. Every decision risks being misunderstood. Over time, trustees may retreat into defensible but unimaginative outcomes. Innovation may give way to caution. Flexibility may exist, but it's rarely used. Now, none of this means discretionary trusts are unsuitable for long-term planning, but it does mean that they demand ongoing investment in trustee quality, in governance clarity, and in communication discipline. Families often underestimate this. They assume discretion is somehow self-sustaining, that once established, it will simply adapt. It doesn't. Discretion is a muscle. Used well, it strengthens judgment. Neglected, it atrophies. So, choosing a discretionary trust therefore involves far more than just selecting a structure. It involves committing to the conditions that allow discretion to survive beyond the first generation. And without that commitment, early success becomes just a false comfort. Discretionary trusts work best where the family accepts that judgment will be exercised and that outcomes will not always be equal. Discretionary trusts are often presented as the sophisticated option, flexible, adaptive, capable of responding to changing circumstances, and that reputation is deserved. But it is wholly incomplete. Discretionary trusts impose a cost, not financial, but human. And there are families for whom that cost is simply too high, because the first cost is endurance. Discretion doesn't exhaust itself quickly. It must be exercised repeatedly year after year, often in circumstances that feel only marginally different from the last. Trustees are required to revisit the same tensions explain the same reasoning, and absorb the same disappointment. Over time, this can become incredibly wearing. Trustee fatigue is not just a theoretical risk. It's one of the most common reasons discretionary trusts drift. Trustees rotate. Institutional memory thins. New trustees inherit expectations that they didn't create and patterns that they feel reluctant to disrupt. In families where continuity of trusteeship can't realistically be maintained, discretion often decays faster than anyone ever anticipated. The second cost is emotional literacy. Let me explain. Discretionary trusts work best where beneficiaries can tolerate ambiguity without taking it personally. Not every family can. In some families, every decision is read as commentary. Approval feels like endorsement. Delay feels like doubt. And refusal feels like rejection. Where this dynamic is entrenched, discretion doesn't mature beneficiaries. It infantilizes them or antagonizes them, sometimes both. The third cost is governance clarity. Discretionary trusts require trustees who are willing to disappoint. That sounds obvious. In practice, it's rare. Trustees chosen for closeness, loyalty, or convenience often struggle to exercise real discretion. They want to smooth outcomes. They avoid confrontation. They turn judgment into routine. And at that point, discretion has become performative. The structure still exists, but the substance has gone. This is why discretionary trusts are a poor choice, where trustees are expected to be relational rather than authoritative. Where trustees are selected primarily to keep peace, discretion will collapse into expectation. There are also circumstances where discretion itself becomes destabilizing. In families with clear, settled expectations. In second marriages where predictability matters more than adaptability. In situations where income security is central to personal dignity. In those cases, discretion can feel less like flexibility and more like exposure. So choosing a discretionary trust in those circumstances is not sophisticated. It is, in fact, evasive. Discretion is powerful, but it's demanding. It asks trustees to carry an emotional weight over long periods, and it asks families to live with uncertainty, even when certainty would be more humane. And recognizing when that demand is unrealistic is far from being a failure of imagination. It's actually an act of judgment. And judgment, not flexibility, is ultimately what determines whether a trust works. Part 3. Fixed interest trusts. Now, fixed interest trusts take a different approach. Certain beneficiaries have defined rights, income, capital, both. Trustees have limited discretion. Their role is more administrative. The advantage here is clear: certainty. Beneficiaries know what they're entitled to. Planning is easier. Disputes about discretion are reduced. These types of trust are often used where balance is needed between competing interests. For example, providing income to one person whilst preserving capital for another. The cost of certainty, however, is rigidity. Once established, adapting to changed circumstances can be difficult. After years of discretion, negotiation, and explanation, certainty feels restorative. Income is defined, capital is protected, roles appear somehow clearer. The structure promises predictability. And in the short term, that promise is often kept. The difficulty is that fixed interest trusts freeze assumptions at a particular moment in time. They lock in views about relationships, needs, and priorities that may no longer hold, even just a few years later. This rigidity is rarely felt immediately. It emerges gradually as lives diverge. An income beneficiary who was once dependent now becomes capable, but remains structurally entitled. A capital beneficiary who was once distant becomes engaged, but remains deferred. Trustees find themselves administering outcomes that feel misaligned with present reality, but perfectly aligned with past intention. And at that point, certainty becomes constraint. The structure doesn't adapt. It resists reinterpretation. Trustees are no longer exercising judgment in any meaningful sense. They're just executing instructions. That can feel reassuring, but it also means that the trust has lost its capacity to respond intelligently to change. And this is the hidden cost of certainty. Fixed interest trusts often feel most comfortable at the moment they are created. They reflect a more clear moral logic. Someone needs security, someone else can wait. Roles are defined. The arrangement feels orderly, even reassuring. In families emerging from uncertainty or conflict, that clarity can feel like a lot of progress. The difficulty is that fixed interest trusts assume that the future will broadly resemble the present. They freeze a set of assumptions about need, dependency, capability, and fairness at a particular point in time. Those assumptions may be entirely reasonable at the moment when they were made. What is rarely examined is how long they're expected to remain true. Because as years pass, lives diverge. An income beneficiary who once needed support becomes financially independent, but remains entitled. A capital beneficiary who once felt distant becomes engaged, but remains excluded. Trustees find themselves administering outcomes that feel increasingly misaligned with lived reality, but perfectly aligned with the trust deed. So this is where regret begins to surface. Not as a crisis, but as a discomfort. Trustees tend to experience it first. Their role shifts from judgment to execution. They no longer ask what should be done, but whether it has been done correctly. Compliance rewards stewardship. The trust functions, but it doesn't adapt. Now, beneficiaries feel that differently. The income beneficiary may feel constrained by dependence on a structure that no longer reflects who they are. The capital beneficiary may feel resentment, not because they were treated unfairly at the outset, but because the rationale no longer makes sense. Neither feeling is easily expressed because the structure itself is doing exactly what it was designed to do. That is the particular rigidity of fixed interest trusts. When they stop fitting, they stop quietly. Unlike discretionary trusts, there is little room for adjustment. Trustees can't just recalibrate outcomes without rewriting the trust. Informal workarounds feel somehow improper and often are. Any change risks being perceived as favoritism or even a breach. As a result, families often live with arrangements that feel increasingly artificial, simply because altering them feels more disruptive than enduring them. This is why fixed interest trusts are often described, in hindsight, mind you, as having worked well until they didn't. Legally, they may continue to function perfectly. Relationally, they can become stale. This doesn't mean that fixed interest trusts are a mistake. They're often exactly the right choice where needs are genuinely stable, where predictability matters more than adaptability, and where divergence is unlikely. They can provide a huge amount of dignity, clarity, and peace of mind over long periods, but they are structurally unforgiving of change. Choosing a fixed interest trust is therefore a decision to prioritize certainty over judgment, to accept rigidity in exchange for stability, to live with the consequences of assumptions made early, even when those assumptions age imperfectly. Recognizing that trade-off early, before the structure is settled, is what separates deliberate certainty from future regret. Fixed interest trusts also tend to amplify sensitivity around investment decisions. Because income and capital are structurally opposed, every choice appears partisan. Trustees are scrutinized not for competence, but for allegiance. Even prudent decisions can feel provocative. Where this persists, trustees retreat into technical justification. Investment policy becomes defensive. Communication narrows. The trust survives somehow, but relationships around it harden. There is another rigidity that families also underestimate. Fixed interest trusts assume a tolerance for inequality that is not always sustainable. One party receives now, another waits. That imbalance can be lived with when the rationale is emotionally accepted, but when it's not, resentment grows quickly. Unlike discretionary trusts, there is little room for softening outcomes without breaching the structure. Trustees can't adjust distributions to reflect changed circumstances without rewriting the trust itself. In other words, fixed interest trusts work best when the future is boring. They're well suited to stable needs, predictable lives, and limited divergence. They're less effective where adaptability, reconciliation, or reinvention are required. Choosing a fixed interest trust is therefore not an act of simplicity. It's a decision to live with constraint rather than negotiation. For some families, that is exactly the right choice. For others, it is a solution to prevent discomfort that creates long-term rigidity. Recognizing which category you fall into is the real work of planning. Part 4. Control and influence. Control operates differently in each structure. In discretionary trusts, control is exercised indirectly through trustee judgment and through the framework set at creation. In fixed interest trusts, control is exercised directly through defined rights. Settlors often underestimate this difference. Those who want flexibility usually gravitate to discretionary trusts. Those who want predictability tend towards fixed interest trusts. Problems arise when a settlor wants both. That tension can't be resolved by drafting alone. Control is rarely lost in a single moment. It moves gradually, often unnoticed, until families realize that it's no longer where they assumed it would be. In discretionary trusts, control appears to be surrendered early. Settlors accept, well, at least formally, that trustees will decide. In practice, influence often persists informally. Early alignment between the settlor and the trustee masks that transition. Authority feels shared rather than transferred, but over time this changes. As trustees settle into their role, and as beneficiaries begin to interact directly with the trust, informal influence weakens. Decisions are made without reference to the settlor's views. What once felt collaborative now becomes distant. For some families, this is the intended outcome, but for others, it comes as a huge surprise. Fixed interest trusts create a different illusion. Here, control feels retained because outcomes are predictable, income flows, capital is protected. The structure appears to preserve the settlor's original design indefinitely. But this certainly masks a different loss of control. Because once entitlements are fixed, trustees have little room to exercise judgment. Influence over future outcomes diminishes, not because the trustees take over, but because the structure itself has become dominant. Decisions are no longer made by people, but by the deed. This shift is often underestimated. Settlors who expect to stay involved frequently discover that involvement has become purely symbolic. They can advise, but not alter. They can express concern, but not redirect. Control has migrated into the document itself. Attempts to claw it back through protectors, vetoes, informal pressure tend to destabilize both models. They introduce ambiguity where clarity was assumed, or constraint where discretion was intended. The common mistake is to focus on who holds power at the outset, rather than where power will sit over time. Discretion transfers control to trustees. Fixed interests transfer it to the structure. Neither leaves it with the settlor. Understanding this migration matters because families often choose between discretionary and fixed interest trusts based purely on a misunderstanding of control. They select the structure that they believe preserves influence, only to find that influence fades in a different way. Choosing well requires accepting that control will move. The question is not whether that happens, but where you are prepared for it to land. One reason families struggle to choose between discretionary and fixed interest trusts is that they often misidentify the problem they're actually trying to solve. They arrive perhaps with a surface concern, uncertainty, tension, fear of unfairness, anxiety about control, and they simply look for a structure that appears to address that symptom. But what they're often responding to is something far deeper. You see, discretionary trusts are frequently chosen to avoid declaring preference. Flexibility feels fair, ambiguity feels generous. But what is often being avoided is the discomfort of admitting that outcomes should not be equal. Fixed interest trusts are frequently chosen to avoid ongoing negotiation. Certainty feels somehow calming. Rules feel safer than judgment. But what is often being avoided is the difficulty of living with disagreement over time. And in both cases, the structure absorbs unresolved tension. For a while, this works. Trusts are excellent at slowing things down. They introduce process. They create distance between people and decisions. And that distance can feel like relief. The danger is that form begins to substitute for clarity. Advisors can unintentionally reinforce this. In moments of family stress, the instinct is often to stabilize rather than confront, to recommend structures that feel soothing rather than those that force difficult admissions. The result is a technically sound structure solving the wrong problem. A discretionary trust will not teach a family to tolerate uncertainty if the family fundamentally fears disagreement. A fixed interest trust will not create fairness if the family cannot agree on what that fairness actually means. What it will do is just postpone the reckoning. Choosing between discretion and certainty therefore requires an entirely different question. Not what structure is better, but what discomfort are we trying to avoid? When families answer that honestly, the structural choice is usually very clear. When they don't, no amount of drafting will produce lasting stability. Part 5. Risk and suitability. Risk also differs between the two types of structure. Discretionary trusts can offer greater protection from beneficiary risk, divorce, creditors, poor decision-making, because beneficiaries don't own anything outright. Fixed interest trusts offer less protection. Entitlements can be exposed. But discretionary trusts create different risks: trustee error, perceived unfairness, governance failure. Suitability depends on context, family maturity, asset type, time horizon, tolerance for uncertainty. And there is no universally better option. Part 6. Choosing between them. The right question is therefore not which structure is more sophisticated. It is which structure matches the problem being addressed. If flexibility and protection are paramount, discretionary trusts usually fit. If certainty and balance are paramount, fixed interest trusts may be preferable. Trying to hedge by overcomplicating either structure often introduces fragility rather than resilience. When families struggle to choose between discretion and certainty, they often try to have both. The result is the hybrid trust, a structure designed not to resolve tension, but to postpone it. These arrangements usually sound sensible. Income is fixed, but capital is discretionary, or discretion exists, but within narrow bounds, or trustees have powers, but protectors retain vetoes, or letters of wishes are drafted with such specificity that discretion becomes cosmetic. Each element is defensible in isolation, but together they create confusion. What these structures share is a reluctance to confront the underlying question: who should bear uncertainty and who should be protected from it? Instead of answering that directly, families distribute uncertainty thinly across the structure. No one has full security. No one has full authority. Everyone has just enough exposure to feel uneasy. Trustees in these arrangements often struggle most. They're given powers, but not confidence. They're asked to exercise judgment, but within boundaries that are constantly being second-guessed. Every decision feels provisional. Every outcome feels negotiable. And this is not discretion. It's simulation. Beneficiaries sense this quickly. They learn that outcomes can be pushed, that rules bend under pressure, that escalation works. And over time, the trust becomes a forum for negotiation rather than a framework for governance. Settlors and protectors often believe they are retaining control responsibly. In reality, they are undermining authority while remaining emotionally invested in outcomes. That combination is particularly corrosive. The irony is that these hybrids are often more complex, more expensive, and more fragile than the structures they were meant to improve upon. They also age badly. As people change, informal understandings erode. New trustees arrive without the original context. Protectors become more cautious. Letters of wishes are read as instructions rather than guidance. What was once balanced becomes paralyzed. And at that point, families are often surprised by how difficult it is to unwind the compromise, because expectations have formed on all sides. Any move feels like a loss. Litigation risk increases precisely because no one is sure where authority truly lies. So the core mistake is not technical, it's philosophical. You can't draft your way out of an unresolved family tension. If discretion is appropriate, it must be real. Trustees must be trusted to decide, and others must accept that some outcomes will disappoint. If certainty is appropriate, it must be honest. Entitlements must be accepted as constraints, not softened through informal workarounds. Hybrids attempt to avoid that emotional cost of choosing. In doing so, they incur a larger structural cost later. This is why experienced advisors are often skeptical of compromise structures, not because they're invalid in any way, but because they tend to be symptoms of avoidance rather than solutions to real problems. My question is not whether a hybrid can be made to work. My question is why the family is unwilling to choose. Until that is answered, no amount of drafting will produce stability. When families look back on trust decisions a decade or more later, they rarely talk about drafting quality. They talk about timing. They talk about moments when a decision felt uncomfortable but manageable, moments when clarity could have caused friction but also prevented confusion, or moments when postponement felt kind but proved costly. So the most common regret is not having chosen the wrong structure. It's having chosen too late. Families often say some version of the same thing. We thought we were buying time. What they actually did was allow expectations to form in the absence of clarity. By the time the structure was questioned, it had already shaped behavior. Trustees had adapted, beneficiaries had adjusted, informal norms had hardened into assumptions, and any attempt to change course now felt like withdrawal rather than correction. Advisors recognize this pattern quickly. They hear it in phrases like, this isn't what we expected, or we never intended it to work like this. These statements are almost always true, but they're also almost always late. What families mean is not that the structure failed, it's that its consequences arrived earlier and more forcefully than anticipated. Looking back, families often see that the discomfort they avoided at the outset would have been easier to manage than the disappointment they lived with later. Early clarity would have been sharp but brief. Delayed clarity feels blunt and enduring. And this is particularly true where children are involved. Expectations formed early tend to persist, even when circumstances change. What felt like generosity becomes the baseline. What felt like flexibility becomes entitlement. Undoing that psychologically is a far harder thing to do than setting limits from the start. The same applies to control. Families often say they underestimated how quickly influence would fade, or how decisively it would move into the structure itself. They assumed there would be more opportunity to adjust, more moments to intervene. In hindsight, they see that those moments existed, they just passed unnoticed. None of this means that there is a perfect choice. Every structure involves trade-offs. Every decision creates its own risks. The aim is not to eliminate regret, but to choose which kind of regret you're prepared to live with. Regret born of having chosen clearly and early is usually better than regret born of having avoided the choice altogether. And that is a real distinction that this episode has been about. Not which structure is better in theory, but which consequences you are prepared to accept in practice. So as we close this episode, let me draw the threads together again. First, the choice between discretionary and fixed interest trusts is not technical. It's behavioral. Second, discretionary trusts offer flexibility, protection, and adaptability, but they demand endurance. Trustees must exercise real judgment, and beneficiaries must tolerate uncertainty. Third, discretionary trusts age well only when governance is actively maintained. Without disciplined trusteeship and clear communication, discretion narrows and expectation replaces judgment. Fourth, fixed interest trusts offer certainty and predictability, often providing dignity and stability where needs are clear. But when circumstances change, rigidity can become visible. Fifth, certainty doesn't remove tension, it relocates it. Investment policy, income versus capital, and perceived imbalance can become persistent sources of strain. Sixth, control migrates in both models. In discretionary trusts, it shifts towards trustees. In fixed interest trusts, it shifts into the deed. Seventh, hybrid structures often signal avoidance. Attempting to combine discretion and certainty usually diffuses authority and creates fragility rather than balance. Eighth, the most common regret is not choosing wrongly, but choosing too late. Every structure carries a trade-off. The real task is deciding which discomfort is more honest for the situation at hand. In short, the question is not which structure is superior, it is which consequences you're prepared to accept. That was discretionary trusts versus fixed interest trusts unpacked. Join me next time as we examine trusts and their role in holding, controlling, and planning the exit of family businesses. Until then, I am Alexander von der Vellen.